Okay, let's take a look at Napoleon Against Europe by Hexasim. This is the designer of this game also did Nations at Arms, which I've heard very mixed things from, and those mixed things are kind of intriguing in the sense that in that particular game, some people seem to reflect it as, oh, this is the coolest of the Napoleonic games they've seen. Not this one, but the Nations at Arms. This one's a little newer. And yet it's a fairly detailed game. And the other thing I've heard about it, other than that the rules sucked and they've been improved, supposedly with a living rules situation, but was that it's totally, bogus in terms of the history that it provides. Now, given my love of games like Europa Universalis or La Grande Guerre, there might be something that's slightly broken in it, but that it provides this wonderful picture into the situation that may be just what I want. But anyway, I've been holding out on that, waiting for a copy at a reasonable price, when one of my viewers offered this to me in exchange for making a review of it. And given that I'm already interested in Nations at Arms, I thought this would be very, very interesting. So I agreed. And, I feel this special warmth in my heart when viewers offer me a game. I'm not sure why. It's better than any other. Certainly better than getting review copies from companies, but it's just something very special to me. The problem, of course, is I can't always do a review for something, but this one I was definitely interested in enough that I do want to get it played relatively soon. So it was an easy thing to agree to. I've already done the introduction scenario and hit, some of the examples, etc. And then I'm hoping to provide my normal coverage outside of that. That was just really kind of a, hey, why don't I video my little playing around with the game and see what that works out to. Not that what I normally do is any different. The first thing that strikes you is the map is kind of gorgeous, to tell you the truth. First of all, it's a mounted map. The very, very pretty color scheme to it, and it just is very appealing to me. I'm not quite sure why some areas are green or some are tan. That indicates the quality of the forage there. And then we've also got the marshes, which are these colors. Okay. It gives this terrain key, which is kind of busy and hard to read. Which is kind of busy and hard to read, but it does give you most of what you want in here. One thing it doesn't give you is what is a citadel, as distinguished from regular fortresses, which are either capitals like these or this. There are a couple of special case cities, however, which may qualify as the citadels. Constantinople is one of them. I don't remember what the others are. Mantua is one of them. And that's kind of a weird. You see, it's bolder than these others. And then the other one I think is Gibraltar, which also looks like it's bolder. Constantinople looks a little heavier than these. So I think those are the citadels, and they're a higher level and give a penalty for siege. So this game covers the Napoleonic Wars running from 1805 to 1815, sort of the traditional, ever since War and Peace people have been putting out games on that span. Nation at Arms actually covers the Revolutionary period, but it doesn't give you one grand campaign. you have a campaign for the first couple coalitions against France, and then you've got the 1805, I don't remember the ordering there, through 1815, kind of standard thing. Now this one actually doesn't go to 1815. There's an 1815 scenario, which is the one I did as the training scenario, and I bailed after it became obvious that that the French were going to win it. This one actually ends in 1814, which is kind of cool because that's, you know, historically Napoleon essentially loses in 14 with his exile. And when he comes back, games tend to try to use special rules to cover that. It may make more sense just to say, hey, it's over at that point. Okay. Lots of color description of the different units. Again, the counters are very nicely, they come rounded actually. A little bit of corner nub. Been using emery board to clean that up. One issue that I've had though has to do with the placement of these markers, the alliance and control markers. So most of them are actually, well, all of them are actually printed on the board for the 1805 situation, and there really aren't enough counters to cover if you wanted to fill in for all of those. And it's kind of a little annoying because this doesn't indicate whether this is just territory controlled by France or is an allied territory. And you start putting too many markers on the board though, and it starts getting kind of confused. So I'm kind of leaving it as it is with that. Your regular units, okay, your core, most of them have 2 steps to them. And on the reverse side, there'll be a single step. They have a morale factor and then a movement factor. Pretty standard there. Elite units will have a little star next to their morale. Cav have a little C here. That's going to give you certain benefits. Limited movement. We don't know what that is. So we're going to have to see what that is, because I was not afflicting the French National Guard with any kind of restriction. It probably is they have to stay in their home country, but again, it's not expressed right there. So a number of the units have a little marker here indicating when they enter play. An E indicates an event card has to be done. A V is the annexation of Venice. And 2P is when Poland includes a second province. I thought it was a third province. Units with a dot on them indicate they can't be rebuilt. Okay. There's these special units which are not there. I've got them over here, I think. Got some of them over there. They're significantly smaller than the normal units. They're basically assets. These come through in an event card, and they don't have a combat value, but they do take a loss step, and they give a special bonus. The problem is, if they're just one units, a special unit is eliminated if all combat units of the force with which they are placed are eliminated or following absorbing a loss in the battle in which their bonus is used. There's a good chance that those can't be regenerated. We'll see with the cards that they are created with. I haven't looked at them. Depots have 2 sides, a mobile side, only 3 movement points, and then a fixed side, which gives them a defensive combat value if they're alone. I don't know what that red 3 is. Oh, I guess the morale for them. Fleets are going to have 2 values, an initiative value. Wow, I've been reading these wrong. An initiative value and a movement allowance, and then they have a leader on the back side who's going to give the tactical rating for it. And again, here we've got limited movement. Those guys in particular are only allowed to exist in the Mediterranean. So generals, again, might have an entry restriction. This number up here is their initiative value. This is a CDG, and like a lot of CDGs, you pay their initiative value in order to activate them. They have a rank, like in Empires in Arms or Europa Universalis or even Frederick the Great. The best ranked leader, the lowest rank in this case, is going to be in command of any given force. And then you have tactical values, and those are distinguished as attack and defense in this game, which is kind of nice to have both on there. On the reverse side of a leader, okay, some of them will just have a number there, which indicates when they appear in the game. Some of them will have a red slash through the number, which indicates the year that they leave the game. And then some of them leave the game when a specific leader... I'm sorry. Is that right? Blucher... Oh, no. Some of them remove a leader, is what this is saying. If a general doesn't have any units, he's going to go into your reserve. And I've got my reserves over here. These are forces you can build, usually in the year-end phase. Number of special markers here. So this is just a control marker, supposedly. But if you control something, you can actually integrate it into your national territory at a later point. The French have capacity to turn things into protectorates, which have some special rules. All countries can ally certain territories. Unsupplied and demoralized counters. These have to do with siege. Once a siege is completed, you'll create an empty fortress, and that'll regenerate over time in the new owner's hands, or they can detach forces to rebuild it. A bunch of event reminders. A lot of CDGs have this. When a card's been played, you want to put a marker out just to remind you that it's in play. And then we have an activation point reserve. When you play activation cards, you can store some of them on your track. And here indeed we have the citadels specified, just not on there. Any zones with a little star in them are special. They're important for conquering territory, the countries. And they may also give a bonus card to certain players. A port is going to have a little anchor on it, and it can hold 3 fleets. Okay, and then national borders. Well, there's various different borders. So all the little spaces in the game are zones. These little dashed lines divide up zones in the same province. And then within that, you have kind of a darker line to indicate national borders. That's these. And then a red line indicates national borders of great powers, which there's a lot of different colors and representation on there. I think I'll get used to it, but right now it's somewhat confusing to me. Okay. Okay, to take over an enemy zone, you have to drive the enemy forces out, and if there's a fortress there, you had to have conquered it, or have a supplied force present during the conquest phase, and then you get a control flag there. Or you can spend a movement point in a place without an active fortress in order to convert a territory that you're in, much like some of the other CDGs. If you win a battle, you get the territory for free, assuming there's no fortress there. A glossary of all the different words here, which is of some importance. All right. The sequence of play. So this is not as well described as you might like it. The game is divided into yearly turns, and you'll get a hand of cards for the yearly turns. There are going to be 6 or maybe 7 activation phases in each turn. And in those phases, you'll be playing a card. In between turns, you hit this inner phase, and then you also hit at the end of each turn certain other facets that happen. Okay. In the interphase, you're allowed to declare war. Then you get your new hand of cards, and you're allowed to discard cards before you get your new draw, but you can hold them between turns if you like. Now, many of the countries, Spain and Turkey, I think, are the exceptions of the major powers, have permanent cards. Prussia may not have one, which go to the proper side if they're aligned with that side, and that player gets those cards automatically as part of their hand. Then you'll get resource points, and you can spend them on replenishing units. Then you have a diplomatic phase, and starting with the coalition player, you can use a maximum of 2 cards from your hand, and you can take a diplomacy action on either a minor or neutral major power, or establish a protectorate on an allied minor power, if you're the French, or try to stop a foreign war, or you can play certain events that have a fairly that have an effect at that time. At this point, any neutral major powers, forced allied units, or forced peace units can be moved, and the control of those is determined within the rules. And then finally, everybody's allowed to move their forces in a strategic redeployment, preparing for the next campaign season. On the campaign season itself, it's a pretty standard CDG. You play a card, you can play it either for the operations points or for the event. Some of the cards are going to be combat cards, etc. The action points they call them action points. The action points that you can spend on multiple units. So it's not like just move one stack, as some games have. And you could play it for the event instead. That's pretty major cost, actually, but, well, I don't know. If you don't want to play a card, you get 1 AP that you can spend. Or you can do nothing if you wish. You're also allowed to establish protectorates at this time. If it's winter, which is up here, you're allowed to try to end a foreign war. Now, you're able to try to end a foreign war elsewhere as well, so I don't know. And on 2 of the rounds, you can take a diplomatic action on a minor by playing a card. After all the activation phases, besieged forces will suffer a final siege test, and then certain forces, those that are out of supply, besieged, or demoralized, get an attrition roll in addition to whatever else they might have gotten during play, and then you check the victory conditions, and then you push on to the next turn. Your hand of cards is going to be based on your game situation. Certain provinces, etc., will give you additional cards. Certain situations give you additional cards, which will be spelled out. Oh, I forgot about this. Yeah, you have to use a card when you attempt to intercept during the opponent's turn. And it has to be one that can command that unit. Some cards have an FW, they're foreign wars. That means the units noted on the card are placed in a special foreign war box. I don't know if that's here. We also have a Corsairs box up there. And the coalition player decides which units he's sending off to that war. These units can't return to play until the war ends, and the war ends either through an event card or playing an operations card of any value during the diplomatic phase or in a winter activation. Then you roll a die, add the value of the card, and on a 5 or more you end the war. If you end the war, the war card is removed from the game permanently, and the units return as reinforcements during the next budget phase. Some of the cards are combat cards. I don't know if we have any. Yeah, you'll have to look at one of the playthroughs, but basically you're allowed to play any number of combat cards in a battle. When they're played, again, not terribly well described in the rules, but a little bit of thought about it. You can probably come up with when you should be allowed to play them and how. Okay, let me pause for a bit. Okay. So the interface itself, this is what was kind of confusing me. I'm just going through this, but and then I see diplomacy over here. Got me. Has its own specific rules. So the first thing is the players can declare war on the neutrals. And remember, this is only a two-player game. This isn't one of those big freewheeling diplomacy type games like Empires in Arms or War and Peace for that matter. Or Napoleonic Wars, which can be. This is designed to be a Britain versus France struggle with them performing certain diplomacy on the neutrals. Now, what that means is Napoleon can probably get away with the, okay, I attack Austria in 1805, I hit Prussia in 1806, etc. Anyway, which is why declaration of war. Anyway. Hand building phase. So this is when you do the assignment of cards here, which we've already kind of discussed. It's basically a dealing out of cards up to your hand size, which is bounded on both sides by 6 and 10. No matter how badly you're doing, you'll get 6 cards, which is good because there's 6 different state activations, and the most you can end up with is 10 at that point. And then we come to budget, and for each neutral at war, enforced peace, or enforced alliance major power, are going to have resources that they produce, and that's shown on the player aid. This must be the player aid because it's the big one. And this gives the rules for what gives cards. So for example, Gibraltar and Malta, I'll give a card to either the Empire or Coalition. That's about all it really says there. These are really high quality. Here's the production. No. Resource table. Right? Yeah, so each country gets this many resources. Britain has a special situation where they get a free fleet card or a free, a free fleet or a free card each turn. Prussia and Spain have special abilities. Prussia has to have reformed the Holy Roman Empire and be at war with another major power to get their bonus. Spain must be in the War of Liberation, and then they can no longer produce fleets. Now, for every one of your keys that you're missing, you lose 4 off your resource total. The opponent doesn't gain it, you just lose it because it's disrupting your internal capabilities. And those resources can be used, I think it's 1 point per army you flip over. It's 1 point per step, essentially. So if you flip one of your corps over from the weak side to the full side, that costs you 1, and it costs you 2 to build a completely new unit. New units are going to be put in a capital or non-besieged fortress in your national territory following stacking rules. Fleets have to go in a port. You have a limitation to how many fleets you can build. I think it's 1 per turn for most players, but an infinite number for the Brits. The minor countries, minor countries don't actually show up on the board. But I guess all of its forces show up when they're attacked, or if they diplomatically join. And in addition to whatever replacements you get to replace your minor country losses. And this is worded really terribly. Each player adds up the number of allied minor nation units that it controls and receives a one-loss step of minors per 2 minors. An odd number does not give the right to an extra step. Okay, so it's this line, adds up the number of allied minor nation units that it controls, which sounds like you count up the number of core counters or something. No, it's supposed to be allied minor nations with units. Now, whether that means that they actually have them on the board or they have the capability of building units is not absolutely clear. I think it's the latter. Again, the game, the rules for the game have some real flaws in them, but generally a little bit of thinking through, I feel like I can come to a position where I'm pretty comfortable with how it should be done. Okay, in addition, you can throw generals onto the board. Now, I've got some set up that come in on the turn record track. Those are the turns they become available. But there's also generals back here in the reserve, and you can bring these in during the interphase. And basically, you can put them for free in any replacement zones, always with a combat unit or supplied armies. But generals of a major power may be placed directly on minor allied units situated in their reinforcement zone. I think that means in the minor armies reinforcement zone? I don't know for sure. The there kind of defines that. You may also remove units, generals, fleets, depots, from the map. These are returned to the reserve and cannot be rebuilt or redeployed before the budget phase of the next turn. Now, what I don't see here... the Brits can also spend 4 resources for an extra card. What I don't see here is how you get depots. And I'm left with a big question mark on that, because it's very likely you expend them for ameliorating your attrition rolls. Okay. Then you're going to enter a diplomacy phase, which we'll cover in a moment. Then the neutral major powers get to move. Now, which player controls them is kind of based on sort of their general alignment through the period. So Spain and Turkey generally will be controlled by the French. The others will undoubtedly, if they're neutral, be controlled by the coalition. Spain and Turkey might be controlled by the coalition, though, if they were last defeated by France or something like that. Strategic redeployment allows you to move all your own pieces, the pieces you control, that are in supply, and you can't move into an enemy space, you can't move into enemy territory, but you get to move everything, and you also get to move anything with a leader up to twice as far as it goes, but if it goes over its movement allowance, you have to roll on the attrition table. All right, we'll take another break. I'm growing less and less into doing rolls and trying to show examples of play and everything. I kind of want to go back to the way I used to do games. Just boom, here I'm playing it. That's fun. So first they define some terms for diplomacy here. The concept of neutrals. The neutral minors come off the board. An alliance, which allows you to use that ally's forces in with your major powers' forces. But at least half the combat points have to be the general's own nationality. I may have had trouble with that in the 1815 scenario. I think Blucher may have at one point been commanding more Brits, although that's not spelled out. So this seems to be talking about both major and minor allies, but then it kind of gets blurred. But I think you can combine these in. One thing you can do is you can send resource points during the budgeting phase. Remember when you recuperate your units, but no more than 4 can be sent to any one country. This is to mainly allow Britain to support other countries, I think. When a force is conquered, when a major power is conquered, it ends up being put into an enforced peace, and the length of that is explained somewhere else, deep in the rules under conquests. We'll get to that later, because now there's 2 ways the French can force an alliance. One is if a forced peace follows the defeated player having played the card Drums of War, which I think allows them to fight a little bit more fully. And if a major power is defeated the second time by the same enemy, then the Empire discards an operations card, and there will be a forced alliance until the end of the game, unless a special event like Scharnhorst or Schönbrunn takes place. This is going to be a neutrality situation, with the exception that there's a possibility to use French Expeditionary Force cards to bring some additional forces from that forced ally. The French can also create protectorates. A minor country can be permanently attached to France in this way. Remember, no, we haven't gotten there yet. To establish a protectorate, the minor country must be an ally of France. The Empire then discards a card of at least a value of 2 during either diplomatic phase or the activation phase, or may be able to play some events that affect this. And that activation is going to give the French a victory point. Now, the victory points are set here. And France will win if it gets to 20. I believe they lose if it gets down to 0. And we'll go over the victory point chart in a bit. Okay, diplomatic actions. Neutral majors can be the object of diplomatic influence during the diplomatic phase only. You can't try to do diplomacy against a major power who's already aligned. But the exception is if Spain suffers a major or minor defeat, she may also be hit with a diplomatic attack during the diplomatic phase, or even an activation round, if she's allied to France. If this is successful, Spain will go neutral. With minor powers, you can go after you can do diplomacy against a minor nation that's neutral, allied to France during the punishments period. I haven't explained this yet, but once the game gets to a certain point, these additional cards, the punishment cards, are added to the deck, and they show sort of the intransigence of Europe towards being willing to accept Napoleonic domination. And then finally, the third choice is if it's allied to France and they don't have at least a friendly combat step during the epic period. Now, this isn't epic as the initial period when we start the game. This is not entirely clear to me. So, what do they mean by have a combat step? The obvious answer seems to be that that nation actually has a step on the board. And that's what I'm going to go with. But it could also, given the way the rules are written, mean forces present in their country. In order to do diplomacy, you have to discard a card that's at least value 3 for a major power, 2 for a minor with units, and 1 for a minor without units. Now, I'm not sure, again, what it reflects to be without units, without any possible units or without any on the board, and obviously that brings into question neutrals who don't have pieces on the board anyway. Are they easier to move? Again, none of this is really hammered out, and there's no example that cuts it. Now, there is a extended set of play, and maybe that has answers to this shit, but I believe strongly in rules being written and not relying on you to look at some kind of example of play to try to decipher what they mean. In this case, I'm going to say if they don't have a counter. Okay, and then you roll a die, and various countries have a modifier to their alliance possibility. So, for example, Turkey is +1 towards France. That gets added to the die roll. If the major power, if the target is a major power previously defeated by the enemy player, that adds 2 to aligning them with the other side. If they've been defeated by the power that's trying to recruit them, they subtract 1. And there are events that could affect this. And you need to get a 6 or more on this. So diplomacy is not a certain thing. Now, there are event cards that can affect these. And of course, if we look at some of these, you know, +2 to the coalition, that's pretty hefty. That's what most of the nations have. What is Russia? Russia has a +2 towards the coalition as well. So the coalition should be able to form. Prussia, Austria, and Russia are predisposed against France. Turkey predisposed in favor of France, although really they're against Austria and or Russia, mainly Russia, at least historically. Okay. Let's see if we can skim through the military roles, because I've covered most of them in my little 1815 scenario. So, the concept of an activation, well, it's similar to most CDGs. You take the points, you spend the required amount to activate a unit, and then you can move that unit around. If 2 armies are combined, and remember, armies have their own separate counters. If 2 armies are combined together in a stack, they can be moved together. The commanding leader has 1 higher initiative, and that's basically what you pay to activate, is you pay their initiative values, and they would cost 2 to activate his forces. If I want to activate just a unit alone, it costs 1. I don't think you can activate leaders alone. I don't remember seeing anything like that to move them around. There's a rule, if an army is activated, it can suck everything within 1 space of it that's not part of another army. It doesn't cost anything to do this except for 1 movement point to bring those together. And it doesn't actually matter, what the cost of the terrain that they'd be traveling through. There may be a restriction, but I don't think there is. Yeah. You can't go across a river without a bridge, which I think I cheated with, or a mountain, whether or not there's a pass. And as you spend your APs, your action points, you can bank some of them. So rather than using all the value of a card, you can throw some of them using these stock markers. And they are PAs on here instead of APs for some reason. Points action. Anyway, there's no limit to how many you can stock, and to some extent you may just want to not do anything and stock your points, except for there's one problem. At the end of all the action rounds, if you have stock points left, they go away. So you want to make sure you use them within a turn. Command. A general is allowed to command a number of steps equal to his command rating. Now, a general's command rating is this white number here. So Ney, for example, has a 6. That's how many steps he can command. Steps is really the strength points on the unit. So a full strength unit usually has 2 steps to it. doesn't seem like specialty units count against your steps. I'm not quite sure. Reserve cav, I think, can be attached to an army without counting against its steps. In particular, if you have an army marker, you can command twice your command value, including 2 steps of reserve cavalry. 2 steps, including 2 steps. Does that count against you? Well, I don't know, but if I keep going further, and also including 3 subordinated generals, that sounds like they're come for free. I don't know, because generals don't have steps, right? So, and that's where I get the, hey, the 2 steps of reserve cavalry, including, wouldn't count against. But again, I'm just making shit up here. It's, you know, you could take it either way. Each general has a number that shows his hierarchy, which is, for example, Ney is the 10th best general in terms of hierarchy for Napoleon. Now, what that means is, in any given stack, if somebody's got a better hierarchy, they're in command. It doesn't have a complex hierarchy set of rules like Europa Universalis does, where, oh, hey, the best leader has to be in charge of the best stack on the board, which can cause all kinds of problems in that game. It's nothing that complicated. In general, there can only be 1 general in charge of a stack, except in the case of an army. An army can have, what, 3 subordinate generals. Okay. Stacking limitations are basically 1 force. So in each given space. So, you know, if you've got a fully stacked units in under 1 commander, unless you can exceed his, unless you can create by like bringing another commander in or something, a bigger space for him, you're not going to get more forces in the area, and you can't have 2 forces operating in the same area. Land movement. Use the slowest movement factor of the stack. During bad weather, the movement factors are reduced by 1. Bad weather is going to be the 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds of the activations. Now, you can get yourself additional movement points off the forced march table. Sorry, there is no forced march table. Off the attrition table, you can announce, I believe it's up to 3 additional movement that way. And you'll have to roll for attrition in that case before you go into any battles. No, it's not possible to move across a vertex. Okay. You can't cross a strait if the enemy is at sea. In the maritime zone, fleets and ports are not considered at sea. However, like many things in this game, there's exceptions. So the strait between Copenhagen and continental Europe can be crossed even if an army or fleet is in the controlling area. There's just a lot of little pieces like that to this. I'll probably forget some of them. That's life. You can pick up and drop off units. What's not nicely spelled out from what I can see of the rules is that a unit can only move once per activation phase or something like that, which means I don't know what. You know, I think that's intended, but again, it's not spelled out in the rules, and that's fine. I don't care if the rules are complete. I can make up my own game. Forced marches, so I've already talked about this. You can add up to 3 additional movement points. You have to make a roll for attrition in that case. Interception. So if the enemy enters a zone adjacent to friendly forces, a single non-demoralized force commanded by a general can attempt to intercept. The player must play a card that could command that that could activate that general. You get no points back or anything if you play too big a one. And then you roll a die, and you have to get a 5 or more, but you get bonuses if you have cav superiority, better initiative, or penalty if you're trying to intercept into difficult terrain. What's difficult terrain? Yeah, I don't know. Damned if I know. Did they say anywhere? I don't know. Yeah, ba ba ba. Yep. Certainly marsh would be difficult. I would guess across a mountain is difficult. Maybe across a river. Maybe it's defined somewhere in the glossary. So far I'm 0 for 4. There we go. Difficult terrain. All movement in such a zone requires the expenditure of 2 or more movement points. Okay. Well, there ought to be a difficult terrain listed up here then. Nope. Not there. Well, that's fucking useful. Great. Okay, well, we'll make it up as we go, you know. And again, there's a living rules out there. Maybe that covers it. I'm not going to try to deal with the rules that are not written when I'm not, you know. The game that I most recently did, and it created hell for me because I have a fucking stapled book instead of a bound one, and I'm flipping through, and this is hard enough in terms of table space. The living rules weren't that big an advantage that I've often found to be the case. Give me errata and give me a non-glossy rulebook that I can write in, and I'm happy. If you had to change so much that you did a full rewrite, you republish the rules and send them to the people who own the game, I think. That's the standard that GMT has set, and, you know, these other companies, I'm just becoming less and less willing to cope with whatever their terms for the rules are, which is, yeah, we'll publish this on the web. You're not, you paid for this, not I, but, you know, and you're not going to get it. To me, that's bullshit. You get the rules close enough to write, and you make it so that where you made mistakes, they can be easily corrected. You give people a change log, errata types sheet, and you give them paper that they can write on. You know, that's part of the rules. Yeah, there we go again. All right. Or you let them make it up and don't worry about supporting the game, which I'm good with too, actually. I just fucking hate living rules. Living rules make me feel like, oh, I don't have the modern version of the game, but I can't have it because they're not providing me with the published support. It's just online shit. Okay. So if you move into a zone with an enemy force, that enemy force can attempt to evade any battle that you try to do. And again, here you don't have to discard a card. If you're demoralized, you automatically evade, which is kind of a bonus. But otherwise, you make a roll, you add 1 for cav superiority, you add if your initiative's good. You get a penalty if the zone entered by the active player is in difficult terrain. Well, that's interesting. You would think it would be easier to evade in difficult terrain. I have the feeling they copied this chart. You have to get a 5 or more. Now, difficult terrain might be easier to kind of ambush somebody when you're attacking, but on the other hand, it might be easier to get away from them too. I don't know. But we'll go with the rules as written here. If you do successfully evade, you can go into a space that doesn't contain enemy units, or you can go into one that doesn't, and it can't include an enemy fortress that's unbesieged. You can always withdraw into the fortress if you have one in the area, and then you take a siege. The Major Campaign card allows several activations to take place at once, and they may cause a battle, which can allow for two forces to combine to launch an attack. Now, there are ways to negate that as well in the game. The Interior Alliance card, Napoleon has a base card that allows him to screw with that. All right, we're going to pause again. And honestly, I would be playing this, I would have probably gotten through a couple of years of play if I wasn't doing the rules, but I just... I've gotten so far from wanting to describe rules. I never really wanted to do it. And just like I never really wanted to do the reviews, I just want to play games and record them. At certain times you need to check supply when you activate the force. Anytime you're in combat, whichever side you're on, and when you want to do a siege. We haven't talked about sieges yet. We haven't talked about battle yet either. Both were covered in that intro, but to be supplied, a force has to be able to trace the supply back to its capital, or a fortress in its national territory, or the capital of a minor ally in the case of a fortress. Again, that's not clear what it's about. Does that say... this is a translation issue, basically. Are they meaning that the capital of the minor has to be a fortress for you to be able to trace to it? Or are they saying if you're a fortress, you can trace back to a capital somehow, because there's a link from fortress to fortress, but I don't know. And like I say, you use a link of, I'm going to just say it's got to be a fortress capital of a minor for you to be able to trace. The supply links go back to unbesieged allied fortresses, or controlled, or to a fixed depot. Now, depots have two sides to them. You have your mobile side, which you can expend on an attrition check, and then you have a fixed side, which you can also expend on an attrition check if it's stacked with you, but you can trace back to it as a link. And that's very much like an Empires in Arms supply system. A lot about this game kind of reminds me of Empires in Arms. The area movement, a number of other factors in it. It's sort of a simplified version, and certainly a shorter version. They say you can play this in about 10 hours with a couple of experienced players. Empires in Arms is something north of 60 hours. Somewhere between 60 and 100, really. Anyway. At sea, you can supply unlimited length, but you have to be free of blockades on the ports that are tracing, and you can't go through an area that's occupied only by the enemy's fleets. You have to have your own fleets covering if he's there. Minor powers can use sources and supply lines of the major powers, that's plural, which is interesting, of their side. It doesn't apparently have to be their own controlling major power. And major powers have to have their own supply lines. Mixed forces, it's going to be the nationality of the commander of the force. So if you have an army that's like we did, like it's under command of Blucher for the attack, only he has to trace the supply. You don't have to worry about both sides being able to do so. And then we have some limits here. You can't cross unbesieged enemy territory, basically. Unbesieged enemy fortresses, enemy control markers. That's a little weird, because it makes it sound like you can cross enemy home territory. I'm going to have to look into that. if an enemy territory has been controlled, it should be no better than home territory, and there doesn't seem to be any limitation there. The line, maybe there's some notional control marker in your home territory or something is the idea behind that. Because it's 2 movement points between each space, you won't ever be able to cross a pass, but you would be able to cross a river, an unforded river, or an unbridged river. Depots, we already kind of talked about them. If you're out of supply, you have to take attrition before the first battle of the activation, or, guess not. Some cards can't be used if you're out of supply. You have a penalty in combat. You can't use the siege table, but you can lay down a masking force, i.e. put the siege to level 0, and you're not allowed to be rallied if you're demoralized. You have to take attrition checks in the following, and some of this has to do with being unsupplied and should be in the effects of being unsupplied, I would think, but it's soon enough after. If you activate a force that's unsupplied, you're going to have to take an attrition check before the first battle or at the end of the activation. If you do a forced march, same kind of thing. If you're declaring a forced march, you're going to have to make an attrition check. There's a penalty for forced marches. I think I may not have taken that into account in my little playthrough there. Yeah, forced march +1 per movement point required. So however many movement points you want to declare for your forced march. You have to make your mind up beforehand. Interceptions or countermarches force an attrition check. A strategic redeployment greater than the basic movement. And then at the end of the year, basically, at the end of the activation phases, they call it the activation phase. These are particular cards or rounds or something in an activation phase. And you got to be careful because, you know, the terminology in a hex and counter game tends to be so simple and standard. Well, not simple, but standardized. But when we start getting into area and point-to-points and stuff like that, that standardization goes out the window. And quite often there's some subtleness or subtleties built into the system that are written one way, but it may not be the first thing that you think about. And so you often have to page through and try to find how things are. That's one of the things I really dislike about these, is that there's a standardized way of describing and certain expectations that come with the hex and counter games that don't with other board types. Anyway, the attrition test is basically a roll over here. You count up the number of steps you have. You get some modifiers based on the conditions that you're in. The French, for example, get a -2 in general. And then you'll take a certain amount of steps of loss. Now, one of the things you can do is you can expend a supply depot that you're stacked with. Could be mobile even. And that gives you a bonus on the table and also reduces the amount of losses that you can take as maximum. Let's go through battle. Battle's pretty simple. You move into a space with another person's stuff, you gotta attack it. In order to attack it, the first thing that happens is you're allowed to do counter marches, just marching to the sound of the guns. In order to do this, you're going to have to be able to fit in the space that you're going to. Okay. There's certain things you can't counter march through. Mountain without a pass, a straight, a demoralized force. If you're a demoralized force, you can't. You can't do it to a depot without a combat unit to knock that depot out just before the enemy's battles. You roll a die for each counter march. You take your tactical value that would apply, whether attack or defense, to the particular situation that's underway, depending on who's the attacker. And there's a penalty if the battle zone is in difficult terrain. Again, difficult terrain is not terribly well defined. Notably, I don't know if this is difficult terrain, this kind of poor forage stuff. I don't think so, because it's called clear. But other than that, there's only marsh, so maybe marsh is the only difficult terrain. I don't know. Anyway, I would say a mountain pass would count as difficult terrain as well. But that's not in the space you're entering. That's on the border, and that is described a little differently. And there's no definition of it. Okay. Anyway, if you make it in, then you go through this sequence for the combat. And the first thing you're going to do is compute the odds for the forces. Basically, you add up the number of steps that each side has and compare them. And if we look at the battle table, 1 to 4, 1 to 3, we do a simple odds thing. That's going to give a plus or a minus to the people who have larger or smaller forces. You have to keep track of the pluses and minuses separately. It's quite likely both sides will have a positive modifier at the end of the combat. But this is one where it kind of mirrors. So if it's 1 to 3, I get a -2, but my opponent's getting a +2 at the same time. And I don't just mirror the total modifiers. If one side has a greater number of total cav steps, it includes reserve cav, special cav units, cav generals, they get a bonus of +1 to their total modifier. Players check supply, and if you're out of supply, you get a penalty. There's a number of other situational, like amphibious attacks, that give a penalty to the die roll. You can designate one of your elite corps to be the spearhead unit. That's going to take the first loss of the combat, but it has stars on it. Now, the number of stars depends on the unit. So here we have the guard, which has 2 stars. That'll give a +2 to combat, whereas this reserve cav could be the front unit, and that only has 1 star. That would only add 1 to the combat. And then you compare the general's ratings, the attack versus defense rating. Each general has 2 ratings. So for example, we look at Ney all the time. He has an attack of 0, a defense of 1. If he's attacking, he adds nothing to the die roll. But if he's the commanding officer on a defense, he adds 1. Napoleon goes up to a 3-3. In addition to that, you can throw 1 subordinate general in an army into to use his tactical value as well. If you do that, you're risking that subordinate general, and his value, he has basically a 1 in 6 chance in general of being wounded because of that. If he is, he'll just be placed in the reserve during the next budget phase. So it actually doesn't kill your generals to use them that way. There are cards that allow you to kill the generals off. Another thing that you had to do earlier on was compute the morale of the force. What you do is you take the center number on all the units. Well, the one that has the most steps at that morale level is going to be your morale of your force, and that's important a little later in the sequence. In order to actually resolve the battle, you look at the level of the battle, which is the number of steps involved on both sides. Now, there are some limitations. So, for example, a major battle has to have at least 10 steps on each side, as well as 22 total. And that determines which column you roll on. You both roll. The amount of damage, after the modifiers, is expressed here. So this would just be 5 steps of damage. This is 4 with a weighting in your favor in case there's a tie. It's like 4.1 or whatever, right? The C say at least one of the steps has to be a cav step. And that's pretty much all that happens there. Both sides remove their losses. Whoever took the largest loss, and if they are truly tied, i.e. the pluses are already accounted for and we're still tied, then the defender wins the battle. Whoever loses the battle is going to have to retreat from the hex, or space, and they're also going to have to make a demoralization check. And the demoralization check is pretty simple. You take the morale level that you calculated, well, that you determined, and then you add the tactical value of the commanding general to that morale level. And then the degree of the loss, the more steps that the loser lost more than the attacker, reduces that morale value. There might be cards that affect this. You roll a die, and if you roll higher than that final morale value, which is modified by these, and again, the rules are not good at explaining how it works. It took me about 5 minutes to figure out a way of interpreting the wording that made sense at all. I would have done what made sense anyway, but I was very curious about that. Anyway, if you end up having a demoralization, that opens up some things. First of all, you get a little demoralization black flag here. And then also, you're eligible to be pursued by the enemy. And in that case, the victor rolls a die, modifies it by his tactical general. Each step of reserve cav, each cav general, special units don't count. And if he gets above a 6, each point above 6 is going to be an additional step of losses there. If you're demoralized, you automatically evade if you're attacked again. You cannot make any force marches, interceptions, or counter marches. And if somehow you're forced to fight, i.e. you have nowhere to evade to anymore, and you take another demoralization, you're completely wiped out. At the end of the activation phase, if you're still demoralized, you take an attrition test. And now your demoralization continues until your general rallies your force. Or it continues to the second segment of the conquest phase, basically during the interphase type period, after you take your attrition. To attempt the rally, you must be supplied. The general has to be activated. Spend 2 movement points for each attempt, and roll a die, and that has to be less than or equal to the morale of the current force, increased by the tactical value of the general. In the second segment of conquest phase, you'll get an automatic rally if you're in the supply. If a force contains 2 armies, each gets to roll for itself. The retreats have to go into an adjacent friendly controlled area or an unbesieged controlled fortress in that zone. That's a second choice. First, you have to withdraw back. An adjacent zone controlled by the enemy but free of enemy units. And this does not remove the enemy control marker. An adjacent zone free of enemy fortress occupied by the enemy if the odds of 5 to 1 apply, in which case the enemy units are destroyed. Yeah, you can overrun the enemy on your retreat. Otherwise, if the force is destroyed, if its generals are placed in reserve, you cannot retreat across. You can retreat across a river without a bridge or a mountain without a pass, but that causes you 1 extra step loss. If there's 2 armies in a force, they both get to retreat separately. All right, I think we'll pause for a little bit and go on to fortresses and sieges. Now, sieges is one of the reasons, or shows one of the reasons I don't generally do, when I do those, hey, before I go over the rules with everyone, I'm going to fiddle around with the pieces a little bit type of scenarios that I did earlier. Because I definitely screwed some stuff up with this initially. But anyway, the idea here is that as you move through an area, you can dump units off to cover the fortress. And you need what? Number of steps equal to double the value of the fortress. Well, what's the value of a fortress? The value of the fortress is level 1, except for Mantua, Constantinople, and Gibraltar, which are level 2, I guess. And you get one of those little 0 siege marker things on it, one of these guys, to begin with. And then, for every movement point you spend with a force that's sieging, and if you drop units off, they lose all the rest of their movement points. They don't get any. They're just screening it until you activate them again. You get to roll on the siege table, and you take these modifiers. You get a bonus for an army. If it's a citadel, there's a penalty. each plus on the siege marker gives you a bonus. Events can give you a bonus. And you make a roll. And if you get repulsed, you take a step loss. Stable, nothing changes, but the duration of the siege increases by 1, and you can spend more movement points even in the same activation. Honors, if there's any troops in there, they come back as reinforcements later, and then breach, everything is destroyed. If you capture the location, the citadel, city, whatever, you get one of these on it, which indicates it's wrecked, and you can fix that or it'll repair automatically. You can detach a step immediately, which is lost, or spend a depot and the fortress is repaired back to its level and it's yours at that point. During the end of the activations, however, if a conquered fortress is in supply, you get to repair it automatically. Usually one side or the other is on the offensive, so quite often you might be able to not detach troops to defend the fortress initially. Anything else exciting here? Okay, the siege is raised if you ever don't have that twice the strength of the fortress, and it's possible if somebody attacks you, if they force you to retreat or if they drive you under that number, the siege will be broken and you have to get out of the space. Weather is pretty simple. On the 5th round you get bad weather, where movement factor is dropped by 1. On the 6th round, it's the same effect, and the 7th as well. And there are some event cards that have special effects in the winter. There's also no naval movement allowed in the Baltic ice zone. Okay. Unlike the game which it sounds like, I don't see an ice zone in the Baltic. I don't. Maybe it's this line here. If it is, that's not explained on here. But that would cover most of the Baltic, a little further than probably is appropriate. Certainly you could get some boats moving through large sections of the Baltic. Okay, navies. All right, with navies, there's an Admiralty card, which at least the Brits have as their permanent card, which allows them to move all their fleets at once if they wish. Otherwise, you have to activate it with 1 AP per fleet that you want to activate. Once the squadron's activated, you can move it to enter or leave a friendly port. That costs 1 movement point. The fleets, like army units, have a movement allowance here. They also have this, which is their, I don't remember if it's strategic or tactical rating. I think it's the strategic rating that affects intercepts and such not. They can move to a naval zone for 1. They can enter an enemy blockade box for 1, and they can disembark units in an enemy port, which costs them 1. Moving, now this is weird because I wouldn't have assumed this, but moving directly into an enemy port therefore costs 2 movement points. And then 1 more movement point to make an amphibious attack if desired. I don't see that follows from the description, but okay, I'll take that as the rules. Squadrons can only be 3 fleets in total. The Bosporus, you can't pass through it if your enemy controls Constantinople. Gibraltar has no effect on naval movement. Some fleets have geographic restrictions. Now, I was expecting to see a rule on geographic restrictions on land units. Maybe I just missed it. Well, I wasn't expecting, but now seeing that, I would expect it. I do not see anything called out the way that is, and I don't remember anything there. But there are units, land units like the National Guard for the French and the militia and such not, that have a restricted movement. Somewhere it may explain what that is. It's not called out the way it is here, though. During winter, you can't move in the Baltic beyond the ice limit. Only 1 Russian fleet may operate outside the Black Sea, Straits, or the Baltic. Straits, I guess they mean is the Bosporus here. Again, I don't know. It could mean Detroit up there. I doubt it, but. Swedes and Danes only allowed in the Baltic and the Straits. The Turks and Neapolitans cannot go beyond Gibraltar. All nicely spelled out. When you enter upon entry of a squadron by movement, the enemy squadron at sea followed by those blockading one after the other may attempt to intercept. If a squadron succeeds, the other squadrons which could intercept take their test, but not so that the squadron at sea faces more than 3 fleets in battle. Okay, whatever. This is not how you write a rule. I mean, but I think the point comes across. You roll a die, you add the initiative of the fleets in the squadron. Okay, so for this we have to look up on the little chits. Initiative is the number on here. That's going to be how easily you can catch things. The other number is the tactical value. If you roll a 6 or higher, the interception succeeds. If it doesn't succeed, the moving units can continue their movement or attack the squadron in the maritime zone or blockading box. When a squadron enters into a zone, the enemy squadron at sea in the zone can attempt to evade. In order to do this, you're rolling for a 6 again, and you add the initiative value of the fleets of your squadron, the best initiative value of the fleets. Okay. You move your squadron into a friendly port of the same zone, or you can move it into an adjacent zone. And I assume you can move the entire squadron. That's not clearly stated here. It seems to, be fuzzy, but the blockade boxes. Entering in an enemy blockade box costs 1 movement point for a squadron. And this is where the therefore might come from, which is instead of entering the port, I have to sail through the blockade box, the enemy blockade box, and so it costs me 1 and then 1 more to go into the port. If there's an enemy squadron in the port, the enemy squadron may intercept automatically, which causes a combat, but it's outside of the port, so it's a regular naval combat. If the moving squadron is defeated, it must withdraw from the blockade box. If the squadron wins the combat, the blockade is in place and the defeated squadron goes back to the port. Otherwise, you can stay in the port. The effects of the blockade, you automatically intercept any ships trying to leave the port, not enter, and there's no supply by sea for that port. Now, instead of imposing a blockade, you can also sail right into the port, and then you'll have a naval battle. But within the naval battle rules, there is a fortress firing value. And again, this sounds a lot like Empires and Arms' rules. It just sounds like they made a muddled mess out of them, but also they simplified and shortened the games considerably. But you can see the inheritance of it. It's like, let's take Empires and Arms and make it into a CDG and make it 10 hours, in 2 players. But so much of it feels kind of like the same kind of rules that if you have not played Empires and Arms, you may be at a disadvantage in trying to parse these suckers. Not that they're written anywhere near this badly, at least not the Avalon Hill version of them. Although they have plenty of little ambiguities themselves. Amphibious attack. Okay. So you can land troops. If there are enemy fleets in the destination port, you must defeat them before you do an amphibious landing. And you can't just do an amphibious landing anywhere. It has to be in a port. And you can't do one during the winter. The amphibious attack can only be 2 infantry steps maximum unless you have a special bonus. The battle will be resolved with a -3 combat modifier for the force making the landing. If defeated, the force which landed may not retreat. Then the landing force has 2 free siege attempts. And if the zone's not conquered at the end of the activation, the force is destroyed. This means trying to take a city by sea is going to be really, really tough. Notwithstanding the historical siege of Toulon or anything like that, where, a fair amount of time was able to be spent on it. I guess maybe, I don't know. Anyhow. After the assault, the fleets may continue to spend movement factors, moving back out into the maritime zone and paying costs for that. There's an event Corsairs, which reduces the coalition hand by a card unless the coalition has a fleet in the Corsairs box at the moment of the draw phase. To get a fleet there, the coalition player must activate a fleet by spending 1 AP or playing Admiralty and move 1 from the map during the activation phase. You could later move that back into a port of a national territory. My throat is going, and I need to swap batteries. Let's look at naval combat. Now, I haven't done anything with this, so this is going to be kind of sketchy. When opposing squadrons meet and do not succeed or attempt evasion, a naval battle happens. There'll be simultaneous exchanges of fire between squadrons. You roll a die, and on that fleet, you add the tactical bonus of the fleet, which is written on the back side here. Any trouble? So then you add up the totals of the 2 fleets, I guess, and if the difference is between 1 and 3, the lower scorer has to retreat. 4 and 7, the lower scorer loses a fleet, and then his other fleets, not the other player. Between 8 and 11, you lose 2 fleets. If it's higher than 12, you lose everything in your squadron. Now, you only have 3 fleets, so whatever. That's not too big a difference. It sounded much worse to me when I was reading it out on the porch, but no. In the case of a tie, the inactive player decides whether or not to retreat. If he retreats, he lost. If he stays a second round, and this is the only way you'll have multiple rounds, the active player decides to retreat, which will lose it for him. Defeat ends the naval activation, otherwise you can keep moving with your movement points. By the way, the map looks very stained, as though like I had rubbed my dirty fingers all over it. It's not. That's actually the effect on the of the graphic. I don't know, background, whatever. You have to retreat into a port of the same zone, or an adjacent maritime zone, except for the one the active player entered from, unless you're the active player, or into. It doesn't specify that, but okay. Or into a zone from which the fleet moved if you were the active player. Yeah, it specifies an active player there. If the defeated fleet retreats into a port, the winner can pursue it and then continue its activation with a blockade. Naval combat in the port itself. If you fight in the port, you can't evade, but you get, it's only 1 round of combat, and the level of the fortress, each level of the fortress gives you an extra die to roll. So remember, you're rolling 1 die per fleet plus the tactical advantage. So numerical superiority is pretty big. Okay. Admirals don't suffer from wounds unless the Nelson card is played. Minor powers are conquered if their capital and their fortresses are controlled by the other side. Kingdom of Naples is conquered once Naples is controlled by the other side. Sicily becomes a minor allied to the coalition independent of Naples. Poland is conquered only if France is conquered too. If the conditions are met, the minor nation receives an ally marker if it has any combat units. If it doesn't, the attacker can choose to make it an ally or a national territory. The combat units of the conquered minor nation, as well as the fleets present on the map, are destroyed. Okay, so far what we don't have here is the, and I think maybe it's under activations, but turning something into your territory and then turning it into national territory. There's a couple of places where that is, and I may have just missed them. A major power is conquered if all of its key zones are controlled by the enemy, or if all of its key zones are controlled by the enemy except one, and the defeated player doesn't control the capital and has no undemoralized armies on its national territory. And when that happens, you go to peace conditions. Now, they're not going to be a menu like they are in Empires and Arms, but they kind of follow that same flavor. You see the influence so much in this game. The defeated power must suffer the peace conditions as follows. If a forced peace is imposed on the major power and whatever unconquered minor allies it has, the victor gets an additional card or 4 extra resources in its budget. If France is the victor, it can impose the continental blockade, whether or not the card's been affected, been played, and all the ports of the defeated minor power and its minor allies until it once again joins the coalition. Well, we don't know what that does without the card. The conquering player and his allies may annex, and it may be, yes. Okay, it doesn't really look... The blockade? I don't know. The explanation of this doesn't seem to actually tell you anything about it. Now, maybe that's in addition to the card. I'm not sure. But whatever, you do it, and I don't know what that does. If a Drums of War event was played, the defeated power, then the conquering player and the allies may annex up to 3 provinces, and they associate them into national territory of theirs. Provinces containing key zones can't be chosen for this. If you have no other option, you don't get it. But you do get 4 resources per province that you weren't able to take. A still unconquered minor ally may replace a province. The minor becomes an ally of the conqueror or can be integrated into its national territory. The conqueror may divide up provinces between powers of the side. Now, I'm not quite sure how much I see integration into national territory being a valuable choice in this game. In Empires in Arms, it's incredibly valuable because you get the manpower and resources, but we're not looking at that level of detail here, and it doesn't sound like you get additional core this way. Well, we'll see. You might get more replacement points from your income. The resource table doesn't look like it gives you any gain, actually, from that. So I don't know. So you probably want to create miners because at least you'll get troops out of them. The effects of the peace on major powers. The units of the conqueror may choose to remain in the territory of the defeated or leave it. Any previous allies to the defeated nation have to go to a frontier zone that is nearest the movement points containing a fortress. The forces belonging to the defeated nation which are in its national territory go into key zones without attrition. They can completely reorganize their forces. As long as the force peace lasts, the conqueror may cross the territory of the defeated nation and station troops there without relying on the links of the defeated fortresses. During this period, now I'm not sure what that means. They may station troops there or supply lines, but I don't think they can use the links of those fortresses. I think that's what it's trying to express. Hard to tell though. Not sure how much help that's going to be, but you can drop depots, I guess. The duration of the piece is going to be 1 die roll divided by 2 rounded up. And there don't seem to be pieces to record that, but you can use alliance pieces or whatever. And that's a number of turns, I guess. Again, it just says a period of 1 die roll. It doesn't say turns, but then later it says complete years of force peace. So that's... Okay, how about victory? Well, victory reaching 20 points, the Empire wins. The coalition wins if victory reaches 0. If neither of these apply, the game ends in the defeat of both sides. And the victory table is with the escalade table. We don't know when the escalade triggers the cards either. That's another thing we have to look back and find out. We know how the points are accumulated. And maybe... there doesn't seem to be anything on there that helps us. But if we look at the victory points, so when you conquer a country, you get a victory point. When Russia or Britain are worth more, each protectorate gives you a victory point, but you lose them when they're reconquered. Paris is worth a -1. The Triumph of Erfurt card, if you can play that, gives you points, etc. You basically have a set of tasks that can get you points, and you're trying to get to that 20. Okay, so we have a couple of things we wanted to look up that we didn't run into in the course of the card. One is, jeez, I wish I had looked them up before, but I don't remember them. Yeah, I don't remember. All right, well, the budget is one of them. The cards, how the escalade comes into play is another. So we're looking for the escalade here. Okay, you start with the epic cards, yeah. Can you tell us when we get those others? I mean, we know the idea and concept, but we don't know when the fuck the escalade takes place. Jesus. Maybe it's here. Okay, when it reaches 15 points, the punishment cards get shuffled in with the rest. I think this is the only place the rule is. Okay. How do we make national territory? That was another one. It's not there. Activations, I believe, allow us, if I can fucking find the activation point list. Oh, maybe it's movement points or something. Allows us, and this is where the rules suck, is trying to find stuff in them. And they are worse, I think, than the GMT general rules for CDGs. Okay, one advantage of national territory is if you integrate territory into your nation and connect it up with other integrated territory in your nation, you're allowed to build troops there. That is of some value, but I think that may be the only value that you get of that. But I'm not really sure. I don't think there's a way to integrate territory outside the peace rules. There is something in the either activations or movement which allows you to take over territory. And I can't find that now. Alright, somewhere there's a movement point cost, no? We have a terrain effects table which gives you a movement point cost, but it doesn't indicate anything about taking a space. Now, I know that somewhere in the game, if you win a battle or if you win a siege, you take the space. If the space doesn't have a fortress and you don't win a battle, I think you spend a movement point, but I can't find the rule that handles that. It may be somewhere else under ownership of territory or something like that. Conquests and surrender. No, that's not it. Control of zones. Here it is. Okay, if the enemy fortress is conquered, you get it, the area. If you're present in the conquests phase, you get a control flag without spending movement, or a control flag is placed in the zone by spending 1 movement point, winning a battle or a siege. If you win the battle, you can take over an area for free without spending extra movement, and that's that. I think that's gone over everything there is that is in the rules. I'm not absolutely certain. I don't think I have any more key questions at this point. So, I have wasted a weekend getting ready to play this after having, read the rules twice through now. There's a cost, and especially when the rule books are not very good, but whatever. All right, let's send it up. It is important that I read the rules that I have, because I don't want to be referencing through some attempted rewrite for clarity that I can't keep open the way I can have bound a staple-bound rule book. So there's some importance to that, and obviously the next time I come to it, it'll probably be easier for me to pick up. Although I don't know, because it's not a good reference. It does not appear to be a good reference as a rule book. All right, up it goes.